Welcome to this masterclass explainer. Today, we're going to completely stress test the fundamental laws of global finance by looking at the world's most uninsurable asset, the Three Gorges Dam. We are going to push the global insurance industry to its absolute mathematical limits and see exactly where and how the whole system breaks.
Okay, let's quickly dive into our syllabus for today. Uninsurable risk, reinsurance capacity limitations, breaking down correlation failure, the pricing impossibility, and finally, the sovereign backstop. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Case Study Uninsurable Risk. We're kicking things off by establishing the sheer scale of this financial threat so we understand the maximum possible loss.
All right, put on your actuary hats for a second. Ask yourselves, how on earth could any market actually underwrite an event that triggers up to $1 trillion in insured losses? Let's just do the math. The dam sits upstream from the Yangtze Delta, which is a massive economic zone generating roughly $3.6 trillion in GDP. A catastrophic flood there wipes out a massive fraction of physical assets. We're talking factories, commercial real estate, vehicles, infrastructure, the whole shebang. Even if insurance penetration in China is relatively low compared to developed markets, say around 10 to 20%, applying that to a $3.6 trillion economy yields hundreds of billions of direct property damage alone. And when you start stacking on business interruption, supply chain coverage, trade credit insurance, and financial market losses, the realistic insured loss balloons to a staggering $500 billion to $1 trillion.
To really put that absolutely massive number into perspective, notice how this towering projection for Three Gorges entirely dwarfs our historical data points. Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, that caused about $80 billion in insured losses. The devastating Tohoku earthquake and tsunami in 2011 was roughly $40 billion. The $500 billion minimum projection for this event isn't just a new record. It is literally 5 to 12 times larger than the single largest insured loss in human history. It's staggering.
Moving on to Section 2, Reinsurance Capacity Limitations. What's absolutely fascinating here is how incredibly fast we hit the absolute ceiling of our global financial safety nets when faced with a number that large.
Now, since this is a masterclass for finance students, let's make sure we're strictly defining our terms. When primary insurers, the standard companies you and I buy regular policies from, when they get totally overwhelmed by a major disaster like a hurricane, they rely on reinsurance. It's quite literally insurance for insurers. We're talking about massive global entities like Swiss Re, Munich Re, Hanover Re, and Lloyd's of London, whose entire purpose is to act as a catastrophic backstop. They pool global premiums to absorb these massive industry losses.
But here is the single most critical data point for your stress test today. The entire global reinsurance industry, literally every major player combined, only holds a total capital pool of about $700 billion. That's it. That is the hard ceiling of the private global safety net.
So you can immediately see the massive solvency crisis we're running into. On one side of the ledger, you have $700 billion of total global reinsurance capital. On the other, a potential Three Gorges insured loss of $500 billion to $1 trillion. A single event at the dam would swallow 70 to 140% of everything the global industry has. Poof, gone. Multiple major reinsurers would become completely insolvent overnight. The entire system that global businesses rely on for risk management would just collapse. And before you ask about alternative capital, like catastrophe bonds or insurance-linked securities, those add maybe another $50 to $100 billion of capacity. That's highly meaningful for a $40 billion earthquake for sure, but against a $1 trillion flood, it's literally like bringing a bucket to a tsunami.
Which brings us to Section 3, Breaking Down Correlation Failure. Let's see how this single event builds into an unstoppable financial contagion. We've seen the sheer size of the loss, but the mechanics of how that loss occurs is what truly breaks the math. You already know that the entire insurance ecosystem rests on one singular foundational principle: diversification. Insurance collects premiums from millions of people with the baseline assumption that risks are mostly uncorrelated, right? Your house catching fire has absolutely nothing to do with your neighbor getting into a fender bender. Because these bad things happen to totally different people at completely different times, the overall capital pool stays stable.
But here's the crucial point. A Three Gorges Dam failure breaks that diversification instantly. What makes this the ultimate uninsurable risk is that it represents a textbook, catastrophic correlation failure. It doesn't just cause property damage. It simultaneously triggers thousands of business interruption claims, massively disrupts global supply chains and trade credit, and ignites a stock market crash that hits financial guarantee policies. Throw in massive crop failures, life insurance claims from casualties, health insurance claims from water contamination, and marine cargo losses for literally every single vessel on the Yangtze. Every single line of insurance, across every major market, gets triggered at the exact same time. Those protective walls between different risk pools, they completely evaporate.
All right, Section 4, the pricing impossibility. If the system snaps the second the event happens, how do actuaries even attempt to price the premium beforehand? Welcome to the actuarial paradox.
Let's step through this paradox for extreme tail risks. Actuaries typically multiply the probability of an event by the total potential loss to find the expected annual loss. Now, the probability of catastrophic failure at the dam is incredibly low, estimated around 1 in 10,000 per year, or 0.01%. Multiply that by a $500 billion loss, and you get an expected annual loss of $50 million. Now, $50 million sounds like a very manageable premium, but expected value calculations are dangerously misleading for extreme tail risks. Let's say an insurer actually collects and flawlessly invests that $50 million premium every single year for a century. They've only amassed a few billion dollars. They basically get a gold star for 100 years of perfect investing right before they go completely, utterly bankrupt the second that $500 billion claim arrives in year 100.
It's the ultimate pricing impossibility. Think about it. If you try to charge enough premium to actually cover a $500 billion hit, the price is so astronomically high that literally no one could afford to pay it. But if you charge the mathematically expected premium, the loss is so massive that no one can absorb it when it finally happens. This mathematically proves the risk is fundamentally uninsurable by private markets. It's just too massive.
And that leads us to Section 5, the sovereign backstop. Because when private markets mathematically fail, that burden shifts entirely to the state. We move out of private finance and into sovereign risk.
In reality, the Three Gorges Dam is implicitly insured by the Chinese state. If a disaster happens, the government has to step in, fund reconstruction, and eat the losses. But look at these metrics side by side. The Yangtze Delta generates about $3.6 trillion in GDP. To absorb an economic shock of that size, the government would be looking at costs that massively outstrip their roughly $2.8 trillion in annual revenue. Covering a loss that's bigger than a full year of your government's total revenue requires unprecedented borrowing, which could heavily destabilize sovereign finances.
And for the finance students tuning in globally, do not think the rest of the world is somehow insulated just because the primary backstop is sovereign. Even if you don't have direct property exposure in the region, this correlation effect flows straight into international insurers. Multinational corporations have huge assets in the Delta. Global supply chains completely rely on manufacturing there. Trade credit defaults would ripple outward instantly, and global financial markets would take an absolute beating. At the end of the day, those claims are flowing right through to international insurers and reinsurers anyway.
So as we've mathematically proven throughout this explainer, this scenario completely exceeds the capital capacity of the global insurance industry, and it exceeds the realistic annual capacity of sovereign governments. As our source material perfectly summarizes, when a risk is too large to insure, too large to bail out, and too large to recover from quickly, what do you call it? You call it an existential risk. Not an existential risk for the planet, but absolutely for the economic and social systems involved.
Since this is quite literally the world's largest uninsured bet, I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to wrap up our masterclass. If private insurers absolutely cannot afford the math and sovereign governments would be stretched way past their fiscal limits, aren't the 400 million people living downstream already paying the premium, whether they realize it or not? Thanks for joining this explainer. If this kind of actuarial deep dive into global risk got you thinking, make sure to join us for the next one, where we're going to explore exactly what happens to the global shipping system when the Yangtze stops flowing. Catch you next time.